Hi there. Welcome to Season 2 of the podcast series Annenberg Conversations, hosted by me, Sarah Banet-Weiser, the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication. This podcast series focuses on the incredible research that is being conducted here at the Annenberg School. And in this season, we are going to explore how information flows are being shaped and changed in a time of transnational complexities and global media flows, of increased platformization of journalism, and climate communication. So today, we are going to talk about global communication and global media flows. I remember years ago when I would teach about global media, it would be things like whether or not there was a McDonald's in France or a telenovela that sort of transferred over to the United States. Needless to say, in the current moment, with all the different media platforms and digital culture, we have a whole new understanding of what global communication and global media is. So today, we're so happy to have two of my wonderful colleagues here at the Annenberg School, Aswin Punathambekar, who is the director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication and a professor here at Annenberg, and Juan Llamas Rodriguez, who is the associate director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication and also an assistant professor here at the Annenberg School. So thank you both so much for coming. I'll let you explain a little bit more about what you're working on now before I get into questions.
Thank you for having us. This is an exciting topic to be thinking about. Hi, everybody. This is Aswin Punathambekar. My research and teaching focuses on media and cultural change, with a focus on the workings of the media industries, the circulation of media texts from films and television programs to memes and social media stories across political borders, and how those dynamics shape the way we think about culture, identity, and politics. And I do all that by looking at three regions, South Asia, the UK, and the US.
Yes, thank you for having us. I'm Juan Llamas Rodriguez, and my research similarly explores the relationship between media and borders and the connection between both of them. So both how media affects our perception of borders and migration, and how borders in the world affect which media we get access to and how we get to relate to that media as well.
Great. Okay, so I think we should just dive in, to kind of reiterate what I was saying before. Global media has really changed definition over the past several decades as, borders have been diffused and dissolved, and digital culture has allowed us to circulate media across actual borders and create new digital borders in the process. So when we say a kind of cross-border flow of media, what are we really talking about in 2025? What are we talking about when we're thinking about things like platforms where media is played, streaming, formats of play, fandoms, files, infrastructures? How do we even think about global media in this particular historical moment? And is it right to think in terms of all media as global? Should we even define it as something that is different than other forms of media?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I think it's always good to remind ourselves that media, from the material things themselves that go into making media, from film stock to recording equipment to television sets, to creative and business talent, financing, and of course the media objects themselves, they've always been transnational in nature, right? And audiences, and in particular fan practices, have been such an important part of this story, be it a distributor in Lebanon working to bring Indian films into Nigeria, or young American teenagers learning Japanese and subtitling things to bring anime into the United States in the 80s and 90s. Media have played such an important role in shaping national cultures in all sorts of ways. But I think we have to be careful then, because of that story, we don't have to stay within the boundaries, the political borders of nation states. So in many ways, there's a deep historical continuity that's at play here, even in our current sort of digital era. But then at every moment of technological change and the kinds of geopolitical shifts we are going through now, things do shift, right? And so we have to account for what's the continuity, but what's also distinct about this current moment. And I think the phenomenal impact that digital infrastructures, platforms, and most importantly, all the smartphone-wielding audiences and users that define our world today that combined impact of all of those things, I think, is going to shape the way we think about cross-border flows.
Yeah, it's interesting because thinking about this question at this particular moment when it feels like there is a sort of retraction of that sort of global flow, that porousness of borders, and instead something that is much more focused on the nation state, that it'll be an interesting thing to see what happens in the coming years to global media flows when you have heads of state who are going to be putting restrictions on whether or not media can actually traverse borders. And then that, I'm sure, will kind of motivate a lot of ways around those state restrictions. So it's a perfect time to be talking about this, I think.
Yeah. One thing that I always insist on is not only that all media can be thought of as global media, but that media has always been global. I think we think about it a lot right now because we're all always on the internet 24/7. But you go back to the 1920s and Mexican radio was being heard on U.S. stations, for example. So traversing the border that was set up, but media would still be able to be heard. So I think one of the key things that I like to think about is what is making this historical moment different? Is there a significant change, or is it more of a matter of degree? And there's a number of things. So one is the sort of acceleration of how quickly we get access to media from around the world. Changes our relationship to it, changes how we respond to it, changes who gets access to it in specific moments. And there's also the convergence. In some ways, the computer does change how we think about media because suddenly everything we can see it on the same screen. Some of the distinctions of a film is something you only go see in a theater versus a TV show is the thing that you watch on that box in your home are a little more blurry. So even the borders of what a medium is have changed significantly when everything can be accessed on the sort of technology that you hold in your hand, for example.
So I think that's super interesting. And now we also know that Juan is on the internet 24/7 because that's how he introduced this comment. But I also can I just ask you something that you just said about Mexican music being played on the radio in the 1920s. What is the relationship between what both of you work on in terms of media borders and global flows of media and diasporic media within a particular country? Like, what is the connection between Mexican radio that is being transmitted from Mexico in the 1920s and Mexican music that is being created, produced, and performed in, let's say, East Los Angeles in the 1920s? Is that also a form would you consider that a form of global media?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of Mexican-American example is very helpful. I mean, the sort of famous refrain of "we didn't cross the border crossed us" gets us to think about the historical nature of borders, that they are not set themselves. And so when we think about media practices, those not only move across borders, but sometimes the border moves across the practices themselves. So something like Mexican music being played in Los Angeles has a long historical, locally specific practice that even if the place itself changes its affiliation with a nation, for example, those practices continue in different ways. And people move. So when people move, they bring their media practices as well. And people, when they move, they also feel a connection to the place that they've left behind. And media creates a really strong bond in that sense. So film, music, television shows from someone's country of origin now still bring that connection, even if physically people are not able to go back.
Yeah, I think that's the really crucial point here is that we have to avoid somehow thinking that we can map political borders and the rejection of certain kinds of movement onto media flows, right? So I remember this distinctly. If we go back to another really fraught political moment, this was right after 9/11. I was a master's student, and I spent 6 months doing an ethnographic project with 12 South Asian American families in the New York, New Jersey, Boston area. I was spending just weekends with them, hanging out at their homes, watching things that they would watch and so on. And this was at a time when, just immediately after the terrorist attacks, a lot of South Asian Americans were feeling really vulnerable as surveillance, policing was cracking down, visa regimes were being changed, the Patriot Act, and so on and so forth. But there was this incredible media scene at the same time, which ranged from Bollywood producers in Mumbai thinking actively about cultivating the North American diaspora as a market. It also involved grassroots media productions. There was a vibrant DJ scene called Basement Bhangra in New York, which then brought in other generations. So I think we have to be careful that even as we think through political borders, geopolitical shifts, and state policies, there's also this disjuncture when it comes to cultural commodities. Everything from grocery stores moving media to people themselves on the move bringing media with them, how that then creates a new kind of cultural space that both exceeds but is still in a fraught relationship with other forces, including the state, the market, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that when we talk about borders, I mean, when we even use the word borders, it immediately calls to mind a kind of delineated line, like there's one side of the border and the other side of the border. But actually, what you're both saying is that borders are not only porous, and they have been for many, many years, not just with the advent of digital culture, but that borders themselves are redrawn and re-understood depending on cultural context, not just commodities, but something like 9/11. That changes the way in which we understand what a border is and whether or not we can cross it. Something like what's happening now with increased ICE raids and deportations changes what we understand as the border, and that will change necessarily the kind of media that is produced to not only document that, but also media that is produced that kind of emerges from these moments of cultural sort of marginalization and dissonance, right? And so I guess my next question, it kind of continues from that. If you have digital streaming services like Amazon Prime or Netflix or any of them that often produce shows that are designed for a particular region, right? But then they become available. We can see shows from all over the world on Netflix, right? And then when I go to somewhere outside the U.S., whether that's in the global south or in Europe or in Canada, your Netflix, whatever your app is, what is available changes for you as well. So do you think that these streaming services have created a format for different kinds of storytelling? And if they have, what is the kind of difference that makes a difference there? How is the storytelling that we're experiencing now as consumers, as participants, as citizens, how is that storytelling different because of global streaming services?
It's a great question. My answer to that question is usually yes and no. So the advent of these kinds of streamers has opened doors for different kinds of storytelling up to an extent. So, for example, Netflix has been producing original content for Mexico for over a decade now. The first one was in 2015. And you see a shift from the first few originals really trying to push the form in different ways, aiming for genres that were normally not as popular in Mexican television. And then 10 years later, we see a going back to the traditional genres in some ways. So it opens up some new possibilities at the same time that it finds the things that have already been there before and replicates them as well. And same with who gets access to these tools. We get, especially from the industry side, at the beginning of a, say, new platform or a new venture, is this idea of what is it that they're disrupting or what is it that they're bringing in new. And for a while, this had to do a lot with diversity and assuming that the new platforms are going to allow all sorts of minorities, formerly excluded groups in the industry to have access to it. And that doesn't pan out in the way that I think was celebrated as much initially. So we kind of see this back and forth where there is some opening new of those doors of possibility, and then they're very quickly foreclosed. And we get settled into a sort of similar kind of way of media production.
Yeah. It seems like, not to be overly conventional about it, but the digital and the digital landscape, like any other medium of communication, from the telegraph to radio to television to film, comes with it a certain kind of dystopic and utopic understanding of what it can do, right? It's always, it's going to open up, it's going to shatter all sorts of barriers and create this global culture, or it's going to kind of retrench those global borders. And I think it sounds like it's, or at least in my experience, it's a bit of both, right?
I think I would agree. Yeah, it is a bit of both. And one way to start would be to say, well, how is it that Netflix and Prime Video decided to go global, which is once they hit a certain ceiling in the US market, how did they think about various regions and local markets, say maybe in the UK with its very strong public service broadcasting history, or in a place like India with its immense range of languages. And I think we're beginning to get some research now that shows that some of the biggest beneficiaries of the streaming video moment, like you said, Sarah, are production companies with already deep roots in these established media industries, right? So key producers, key directors, the marquee stars, they can quickly leverage their existing networks and begin reorienting what they do, their business practices, to meet this new sort of stream of capital, financing, and this promise of saying you can now do new things that you couldn't possibly with theatrical distribution or cable television, right? So that's one piece of it. And I think there have been some sectors within these industries who managed to find new opportunities. And I think writers and some acting talent has really benefited in different markets around the world. But when it comes to storytelling, I think the picture becomes really much more layered and complex. And I'll give you one example maybe from the Indian case. So there's now, just in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a proliferation of screen stories that feature a range of queer characters, plot lines, and dramatic twists, which is wonderful, and it sparked all kinds of important conversations. But this is also happening at a time when India is in the grip of a powerful right-wing political regime, one that is deeply conservative. This is a government that is clamping down on the same streaming platforms when they show, for example, a political map of South Asia, which the Indian government doesn't like, given its contestations on the border and so on. So queer stories seem to be okay as long as they can be folded into a larger narrative of India being a Hindu nation. But if the stories begin crossing over just ever so slightly, if they cross over into, let's say, an interreligious love story or an intercaste romance, then there's trouble. So I think we have to be careful about claims we make about disruption, or, like Juan said, these industry terms about innovation and entrepreneurship. We have to be cautious about how we deploy them because, like you said, Sarah, in every moment of change, there have been these breathless claims, and then 10 years later, they settle into a new kind of normal, and that's where our research comes in, where we begin to see what these complexities are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also how you started this comment really bears repeating, which is kind of like, remember to follow the money. Right? Follow the money. It isn't that Netflix was like, well, you know what, we should just be a global company and just to invite all these different global perspectives. They're looking for markets, they're finding the markets, and then they're exploiting them like all for-profit media companies do. So I think that thinking about the sort of capitalist infrastructure of global media is always really important. That said, if I could just push on one point about the digital, which is that because so much of media production is now in the hands of everyday consumers, like not completely, obviously, you just gave this great example of the kind of state government coming in to say, no, those stories aren't acceptable. But you also know that fans and consumers are creating their own media. It could be a disruption. It doesn't have to be disruptive, but it could be a challenge. It could be a counter story to a national story. So is that a characteristic of the digital border, that the gatekeeping functions of for-profit media companies are somewhat lessened by the fact, like Juan, you said earlier, everyone has a smartphone in their hand that they can create. I always tell my students, my undergraduates in my class, to remember that they are media makers. Every day they make media. They post, they blog. So in a kind of global context where so many people are media makers, what does a digital border even look like?
Well, I think to follow up on this example, I would say the Netflix interface is a really good example of what a digital border looks like today for two reasons. I think you were mentioning traveling and then opening Netflix in a different country. And a lot of us have had that experience of opening and realizing there's different offerings when we go to a different country and open the same app. And that has to do with industry configurations, who has the rights to distribute the content in the US versus Mexico versus Colombia, let's say, right? So even just the content that is available changes on where you are in the world. So a digital border, sometimes it's the replication of the physical geopolitical border in the digital platform. So it uses your IP address to figure out where you are in the world and then gives you an experience based on that as well. I think another form of what the digital border looks like, even within the Netflix interface, is algorithms. So the whole Netflix model is saying that it's going to recommend things to you based on what it assumes that you like. And digital media scholars have started to make the case that what that does is create these filter bubbles, right? Where basically if you've played something, it assumes that that's the thing that you want and it'll give you just more of the same. So a lot of the time we have Netflix original productions made in, say, Germany or Sweden or India, and arguably you could access them through the platform, but the regular user might never know that those are there because the algorithm assumes that they've played something that is completely different and then they'll never want to see the rest of it. So much of how the content that we access is being curated by these algorithms. It is already creating sections or barriers to how much we can access. So yes, all of it is online, but the question of whether a regular user of the platform is going to access it is another matter.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, it's also another example of how digital media ends up kind of curating its algorithm and your content to what you want to buy, right? And how you are understood as a consumer, whether or not that's shoe ads on Instagram or like me getting every Hallmark Christmas movie ever produced on Netflix in my feed, even in July. So,
well, we'll soon start watching Love Actually once again.
Yes.
When it gets to November.
Yes, exactly. And I also think, when you were talking, Juan, I was smiling because every time I go outside of the United States, if I'm on Netflix and there's a show that I know I can't see in the United States, it's like crazy binge watching, right? Because I'll never get to see it again or until I go back, Yeah. Except for, are you saying that if I actually took a deeper dive, I could find it? Or is it there's industry regulations that say that certain shows won't be aired on U.S. Netflix. And then there's the hidden shows that you never will come across or know how to search for because the algorithm is saying Sarah just likes Hallmark Christmas shows.
And this is I think the social narrowing that's happened even within the domain of, you were asking about, your average everyday person who can create media. There was a brief phase in which, before we had terms like creator cultures and influencer economies, YouTube was a genuinely lovely place where you could discover all sorts of things. But we've now got to a point where about 20 years in, even that has narrowed to a point where as soon as you hit a certain level of popularity, in comes an entire sort of machinery that begins to approach you for brand sponsorships. A PR agency or a talent scout that says, here are the 50 things that you produced, but here are the 5 things that seriously generated interest. Why don't we focus what is otherwise a rich, diverse set of things you like to do and say into this one category and cultivate that as a very particular thing on this social media platform? Whereas the kinds of social discoveries that used to happen, to your point about me finding something on Netflix, that narrowing, I think, is a serious social and cultural problem that we all have to find a way to tackle.
Yeah, I think years ago when I would teach about television in the United States and talk about how network television is a for-profit private industry, and what they would do was make sure, because it's expensive, to make sure that they just kind of replicated other themes through spin-offs or through genres or that kind of thing. And so you just get, basically, it's a lot of the same thing, that, what people used to call the lowest common denominator of television, right? And in some ways, it's the relative openness of digital culture challenges that idea that we need a lowest common denominator because there is so much content that is produced. But what I think you're both saying is that actually in function, what happens is the lowest common denominator, except for it's much more kind of tailored to individual tastes, right? So you get the same kinds of things. I mean, why are we going to see Love Island again? I just saw on my Netflix feed that I can't even remember what country it was, but Love is Blind in some other countries. So we get Love Island, Love is Blind, K-pop Demon Hunters, Bluey is the thing that gets certain global media productions to circulate to some kind of economic success. Is it about that sort of basic capitalist model of, again, follow the money, like what is going to make the most money, even if there are other productions that are created and put on a platform?
I think, again, the answer is yes and no. So I want to take us back to maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, right?
Please, let's go back.
Let's go back. So it was a really remarkable period in many ways because the media world that emerged then sort of comes out of the clutches of Anglophone, what used to be primarily a US film and television dominated international market. And there were always other vibrant centers of media production, right? And all sorts of cross-border flows that we just didn't pay much attention to. But what begins to happen at that point is so many national governments begin turning to media and cultural industries as vital to their own national futures. So you have this incredible moment of nation branding. What was it? Cool Japan, Creative Korea,
Cool Britannia.
Australia Unlimited, Brand Kenya, India Shining, on and on, right? And out of this came some of the success stories that we now recognize, right? K-pop, for example, the Korean state's deep investment in its cultural industry, and K-pop Demon Hunters now has a sing-along. What is it, Juan, this weekend in
Sing-along screening. So for people who don't know, K-pop Demon Hunters, animated film, original from Netflix, about a girl K-pop group that needs to save the world by rallying all their fans. It includes songs in them, and it is on Netflix, but part of the promotional now that it's become so big and the songs are so popular, they're having sing-along screenings where they will screen in movie theaters with the subtitles so people can sing along to the songs.
So it speaks to that fan element, right?
Yeah.
But there are other thriving circuits that don't fit into this narrative of global markets and an easy, almost superficial sort of cosmopolitanism, right? And so this is where if we pay attention to something like, say, Turkish media, especially the television dramas, across the world. And these are shows that offer this potent mix of consumerism meets religious piety that one scholar has called neo-Ottoman cool. And what's fascinating is how these television dramas from Turkey appeal to audiences in all sorts of places, Francophone Africa, parts of South Asia, Argentina. And so I think we have to be careful also not to map, which we used to, on media flows only go to some parts of the world because it somehow resonates with their sense of local culture and identity. Well, Narcos was a global phenomenon. K-pop Demon Hunters is a global phenomenon. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with my sense of national identity, ethnicity, or anything, but something else entirely. Certain ideas of desire, certain kinds of fan practices that may not map onto our local sort of senses of place and identity, but something else at work. So I think the digital world has maybe made us even more aware than we were that media flows can't be mapped onto borders neatly, and they also can't be mapped onto some essential sense of our identity either.
Yeah, and I think that again, is a really good point to keep reminding ourselves, and not to be sort of hopelessly utopic about it, but there is an openness and a sort of flexibility to the way in which not only global media is produced, but the way in which global media is consumed and celebrated. I mean, clearly Juan has gone to a sing-along for K-pop Demon Hunters. Yes, see, he's nodding. He has. That there's like fans all over the world, fans of music, fans of television, fans of film. And when something like K-pop Demon Hunters sing-along is played, let's say in a Philly theater, it has a different resonance and a different kind of meaning than it does when it's filmed or when it's screened somewhere else. And so I think that that's in some ways an obvious point, but it's also one that I think we need to continue to remember as we, as media scholars, remind ourselves and our students and other scholars that media is not simple to define. Right? It's a very complex kind of set of arrangements, including things like infrastructure and capitalism and content creators and influencers and all the rest that we've been talking about. So I guess in terms of that, media production is also an industry practice. Is there anything that you think that regulators or state actors overlook in this industry practice? I mean, it seems like, as we talked about at the very beginning, we can get around a lot of this state regulations. Are there things that you think state regulators are overlooking that are important for us to consider?
That's a great question. And I think I'm glad you used the word overlooked because I think we can use that term in two ways, right? I think policymakers have historically overlooked culture, and overlooked in the sense of almost sometimes too intense and a narrow focus that's shaped by anxieties about gender, youth, national identity, etc. And that kind of intense looking too much into one domain leads to decisions like censorship, banning platforms, trying to police everyday media use, and so on. Or on the flip side, culture often gets overlooked in the sense that it's almost like an afterthought to the real important stuff of capital, technology, the role of the state, and so on. And that also is a very narrow conception of citizenship being about news and information and being good rational actors, when so many cultural studies scholars, including you, Sarah, who've written from a feminist post-colonial angle, saying we need to shift that way of thinking about culture, that it's not an afterthought, it's not epiphenomenal, it's core to who we are as citizens, as people, as individuals, and so on. So, and I think I've come around finally, after all these years of being frustrated, come around to accepting the idea that every generation needs to fight this fight in their own way, right? And make a case for what popular culture is at a given point in time, and why it matters at that particular historical moment. So when I teach this, I always like to use a line from a British cultural studies scholar, I think we all venerate this particular scholar, Stuart Hall, who said we have to think culturally about politics and politically about culture. So in that sense, I think overlooking culture is a mistake we keep making, and we've got to stop doing that.
I couldn't agree more that is a mistake that we keep making, and it's exactly what you just said. Culture is not an epiphenomenon. It is, in fact, where we inhabit the world and what our identities are about, and everything from desire to anxiety to all of it. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up. Juan, do you have a last word on what we might be overlooking or what other people might be overlooking?
Not so much on the what are we overlooking. I think I still talk on the question of what gets through. With this question of what gets through, continuing to go back to the 90s, I guess, it's always a question of both what resonates in the media itself with the audiences and all of these other questions of political economy at the same time and watching practices. The example that I use in my classes is the advent of anime in the 1990s in Latin America, where it was originally a decision of industrial practice, which was importing anime for all of these new television stations was relatively cheaper than importing anything from the United States. So they began importing all sorts of anime shows in order to fill out the airwaves. And that's why they chose it. But that wouldn't explain necessarily why that became such a big thing. That's why we had anime in Latin America in the 90s. Why did it become so popular and enduring? Then you get to think about genre. So one of the comparisons that I always make is that the most popular anime series are like a telenovela, except that it is animated. It's a highly melodramatic nature. It's a family narrative most of the time. So there's a lot of elements that audiences were already familiar with that suddenly you can see in a slightly different format, but that it resonates very commonly. And also watching practices, as opposed to what we think of in traditional American television, which was an episode a week, for example. Both telenovelas and anime series are an episode a day. So you watch 5 episodes Monday to Friday and then again. So it's more of the continuation, and audiences who are already familiar with that watching practice will flock to that kind of idea. So the question of what gets through becomes complicated because it's not only about, it is definitely about the political, economical decisions, but then it's also about genre and how that resonates with audiences. It's also about watching practices. So it becomes a multi-layer thing. And I think that's part of the appeal for us studying popular culture and what that does in the world.
Thanks, Juan. I could talk to you guys all day about this. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I think we should follow up our podcast with a Love Island watch party or a K-pop sing-along with all of Annenberg. I think we could all kind of join in and make our own meaning from it. Aswin, Juan, thank you so much for joining me on this Annenberg Conversations podcast and for sharing your incredible insights and just being such brilliant colleagues. So thanks, and everyone else, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.